They didn't call you invisible. They just treated you like you didn't exist. You weren't unseen because you lacked presence. You were unseen because invisibility served them. They said you were quiet. But silence wasn't your personality. It was the only role you were allowed. You learned early. The less you needed, the safer you were. The more you disappeared, the more they could pretend everything was fine. This is the paradox of the lost child. You survived by vanishing, and they praised you for it, because your absence kept the system intact. You sat at the dinner table, fork in hand, ready to speak, waiting for someone to notice, while the conversation moved around you as if you weren't there. What if your silence wasn't passivity? What if it was the loudest evidence no one else wanted to hear? If you've ever felt present but unseen, useful but unnoticed, alive but erased, this video is for you. It won't be easy, but we're going to expose how your invisibility was engineered, why vanishing was survival, and why disappearing was never your flaw. You weren't lost because you vanished. You were lost because they refused to see you. Let's get started. You weren't born quiet. You were made quiet. You adapted to erasure. That's the lie buried in narcissistic family systems. Some children are just easy. Not at all. Some children just learn early that visibility gets punished. In narcissistic family systems, the lost child becomes a vessel of emotional avoidance. You weren't just overlooked by accident. You were strategically unseen. The system required a child who wouldn't disrupt the illusion. So you became the quiet placeholder for everyone else's denial. You didn't choose distance. They engineered it, because proximity meant accountability. Adler called it compensation. When a child's real needs threaten the family image, the psyche over-adapts so the child disappears from harm's path. So you learned to vanish, not for peace, for survival. They praised you as independent. What they meant was abandoned. They called you low maintenance. What they meant was neglected. And what looked like peace was your silence rehearsed, over and over. Because they didn't forget you. They needed you forgotten. You weren't ignored. You were erased. That's trauma by omission. It doesn't just starve you. It teaches you hunger is normal. It teaches you that attention is dangerous, that being seen is too expensive, that your needs make other people uncomfortable. Adler called this the over-adaptive self, the version of you that pre-rejects your own needs to avoid rejection from them. So you became useful, predictable, erased. Your nervous system learned one strategy: disappear before someone makes you disappear. You started raising yourself emotionally. You swallowed your needs before anyone else had to. You bit your tongue before it could name what was obvious. They called it stability. What if the quiet child wasn't peaceful, just ignored long enough to mistake numbness for calm? You didn't turn out fine. You turned into a version of yourself that could survive being invisible. The one who doesn't ask for help. The one who hesitates before speaking. The one who still feels too much, even when you're alone. And now, you doubt your presence because they trained you to. Let's take a moment to reflect. Who measured your worth by how little space you took up? When did being unseen feel safer than being yourself? What part of you learned to shrink to keep the peace? The silence you lived in wasn't accidental. It was orchestrated, because someone had to hold the weight of what they refused to face. They didn't forget you. They needed you erased, so their perfect self-image could survive. They called you independent because it was the easiest way to cover their neglect. Let's go deeper. You didn't fade because you lacked presence. You faded because they required someone to. Your silence was never an accident. It was architecture. Every narcissistic system runs on a hidden economy. Visibility is currency, and someone has to pay with absence. And you? You were drafted into that role before you had a choice. They praised your quiet as maturity. But what they meant was compliance. They called you easy. What they meant was disposable, because your invisibility served them. In family systems theory, this is displacement. The family projects chaos outward by reducing one member's presence. Your absence becomes the glue. If you don't speak, no one has to face the truth. If you don't need, no one has to give. If you disappear, they can shine. And when they glowed, you dimmed. When they erupted, you swallowed it. When they needed a stage, you became the backdrop. What if your quiet wasn't temperament, but training? Michel Foucault warned, power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it hides itself in silence. That's what happened here. The silence wasn't empty. It was control disguised as calm. You smiled when they looked, then sunk back into yourself when they looked away. You spoke, then watched the conversation glide past you like you weren't even in the room. You learned invisibility wasn't a flaw, it was your assignment. Because someone had to absorb what they couldn't face. Someone had to carry the weight of what was left unsaid. And that someone was always you. Psychologists call this emotional parentification and cutoff. You surrendered your voice so fragile adults could protect their image. Not love, not care, just survival. For them, not for you. Who really benefited from your silence? The child who disappeared? Or the adults who never had to face their true selves? Let's pause here for a moment to think about your childhood. Who in your life needed you invisible to maintain their image? What illusion did your absence protect? And where are you still rehearsing that same silence now? Because here's the part that cuts. It wasn't your fault they needed someone they could erase. But over time, your erasure became your identity. So if your silence was scripted, what role were you actually playing? Because in every narcissistic family, invisibility isn't random, it's assigned. And the lost child, they're not just forgotten, they're hidden. Let's unpack that now. In every narcissistic family system, someone is put on stage. The golden child, shining proof of parental success, the scapegoat absorbing the blame. But the lost child, they aren't given a part at all. They are hidden. Not because they were unimportant, but because their visibility threatened the story. Teachers called you easy. Parents praised your independence. But that wasn't personality. It was neglect, dressed up as virtue. Carl Jung warned that what a family refuses to face is pushed into shadow. And in your house, that shadow wasn't just projected onto a scapegoat. It was buried inside you. Your grief, your needs, your longing, erased before you could even give them language. You disappeared into books, into music, into daydreams. Your presence tolerated, your absence unnoticed. You could walk into a room, and no one even noticed you were there. You cleared your throat to enter the conversation, and watched eyes slide past you. And still, they called this peace. They called this stability. But what looked calm on the surface was your self-erasure rehearsed. Why is quiet praised until it becomes pain? Why do families celebrate the no-trouble child while ignoring the cost of their silence? This is the cruelty of the forgotten child role. It sells your invisibility as love, that the less you need, the more you're wanted. But the truth? Your invisibility was their convenience. You weren't cared for, you were managed. In family systems theory, the lost child is an emotional buffer. While the golden child distracts with achievement and the scapegoat absorbs conflict, the forgotten one absorbs neglect. Your lack of demands became the family's relief, because every time you stayed silent, they didn't have to face what they failed to give. You asked for help once, and the room went cold. You needed comfort, and they changed the subject. So you learned, asking costs more than it gives. Silence, at least, doesn't get punished. The scapegoat gets blamed. The golden child gets used. The forgotten child gets erased, and eventually they learn to erase themselves. Let's take a moment to reflect. Who praised you most for being no trouble? Who used your independence as an excuse to neglect you? And did you ever notice? Others got comfort while you got distance. Because being forgotten wasn't an accident. It was strategy. It was survival. Not yours. Theirs. But silence doesn't come free. It leaves scars no one can see. Grief, guilt, loneliness, all carried by the child who was told their invisibility was love. Let's unravel that next. Silence doesn't end when childhood does. It follows you into friendships, into relationships, into the way you sit in a room and feel the weight of your own absence. Because invisibility isn't neutral, it's corrosive, and the cost of being erased lives in your body. You didn't just grow quiet, you grew guilty for needing anything at all. You didn't just grow independent, you grew ashamed for taking up space. And you didn't just grow lonely, you disguised it as strength, because loneliness, at least, didn't get punished. In trauma studies, this is called dissociation by omission. When needs are ignored so consistently, the nervous system numbs them before they even surface. You don't stop needing. You just stop believing anyone will respond. You still apologize for interrupting. You still cower when someone raises their voice. You preface sentences with, "This might be dumb, but," and abandon them halfway. Because invisibility became instinct. And here's the cruelty. They called you resilient, but your resilience was starvation in disguise. They told others you were self-sufficient, but your independence was abandonment framed as maturity. They bragged about how you never caused trouble. But the truth? They punished you so thoroughly that even asking for help felt lethal. What if you weren't quiet at all, just expertly ignored? Because invisibility doesn't make you safe, it just makes you forgettable. And forgettable children grow into adults who doubt whether their presence matters at all. Simone de Beauvoir wrote, "Oppression works best when it convinces the oppressed to make themselves small." That's what happened here. They didn't need to silence you. They trained you to silence yourself. They praised your sibling for being bright. Your silence, convenient. They compared you to the one who sparkled, the one who rebelled. You weren't the hero or the problem. You were the gap between them. And in that gap, your identity disappeared. Let's pause here for a moment before we go further. Where in your life do you still erase yourself before others can? Who benefits most when you stay silent? And what would happen if you stopped disappearing? Because invisibility isn't liberation. It's imprisonment until you name it. And the silence? It follows you. It lingers in the way you second-guess yourself, apologize too quickly, hesitate before speaking. Because the lost child role doesn't end when you leave home. It mutates. It shows up in adulthood, where you're still performing the same erasure long after the original audience is gone. Let's uncover how that ghost still walks with you now. Silence doesn't just scar your childhood. It calcifies. It leaks into every corner of your adult life. They trained you to erase yourself. So now you do it without thinking. You trip over your words in meetings, then replay everything you said on loop. You type the truth in a message, then delete it. You say, "It's fine," even when it burns. Because invisibility became muscle memory. They called you independent. Now you call it exhaustion. They called you mature. Now you call it overthinking. They called you no trouble. Now you struggle to name a single want without guilt. Therapists call this role persistence. When the childhood script bleeds into adulthood, you don't stop performing the lost child because your nervous system never got permission to stop. So you confuse invisibility with safety, silence with loyalty, compliance with acceptance. You let others talk over you and pretend you didn't notice. You give more than you take and tell yourself it's generosity. You sit at dinner with friends and feel that same childhood gap. Present, but unseen. What if your struggles today aren't flaws, but echoes of a role you were forced to play? Simone de Beauvoir warned, "Oppression survives when the oppressed mistake habit for choice." Your adulthood isn't proof you moved on. It's proof the training worked. And here's the cruelty. You don't even need the family anymore to stay erased. You've internalized them. Their neglect lives on in your hesitation. Let's take a moment to reflect. Where do you still perform invisibility long after the threat is gone? Who benefits from you overfunctioning, under-asking, staying small? And what would it cost, for once, to take up space without apology? Because even when you see the echoes, another wound cuts deeper. The longing. Not just to survive invisibility, but to finally be seen by the very people who built their comfort on forgetting you. This is where we go next. You didn't just want survival. You wanted recognition. Not a medal, not applause. Just a moment where someone looked you in the eye and said, "I see you." I know what it cost, but that moment never came. And it won't. Because in a narcissistic system, acknowledgement is impossible. The entire structure depends on pretending you were fine, on repeating the lie that you didn't need much, that you were the easy one. You longed to be seen. They demanded you disappear. And the very thing you craved, basic human recognition, was the one thing they could never give. Simone Weil wrote, "To be rooted is perhaps the most important need of the human soul. But roots in poisoned soil don't nourish you. They infect you, and no amount of waiting will make toxic ground bear fruit." So here's the deeper tension. You don't just grieve the childhood you lost. You grieve the future that never arrives, the parent who never softens, the sibling who never apologizes, the family who never turns and says, "We failed you." What if the family you're still waiting for exists only in fantasy? A fantasy designed to keep you compliant, holding space for a version of them that never existed. Because here's the truth. Your longing isn't weakness. It's evidence. Proof that you were wired for connection, but conditioned for absence. And that conditioning still tells you to shrink long after the danger is gone. We'll pause here for a moment. What version of them are you still waiting to appear? What does it cost you to keep holding that hope? And what freedom might come, not from being seen by them, but from no longer needing it? Because here's the sharp edge of it. Your survival was unspoken. But maybe your rebellion will be too, not loud, not performative, just the refusal to disappear on command. And that's where the paradox flips. The same silence that once erased you can now become your weapon. Not silence that erases, silence that refuses to perform. Because exposure doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's the quiet act of not shrinking anymore. Keep listening. This is where it begins to shift. They didn't call you invisible because you were small. They called you invisible because your presence threatened the story. You weren't easy. You were erased, edited out so the illusion could survive. And now, your visibility isn't a plea for rescue. It's rebellion. Viktor Frankl wrote, "The last of human freedoms is to choose one's stance in any circumstance. For the lost child, that freedom is exposure, visibility after years of erasure." And Levinas reminds us, to truly see another is the most radical ethical act. When you reclaim visibility, not in their eyes but in your own, the system's denial ends, whether they admit it or not. So who actually loses power the moment you stop disappearing? You, or the ones who depended on your erasure? Let's pause to reflect. One last time. Who taught you invisibility was safer than truth? What would reclaiming visibility look like without apology? And who would fight hardest to keep you erased? Because this is the quiet loop back to exposure. They called you silent to excuse their neglect. But silence was never emptiness. It was survival. And now, you decide when the silence ends. Not to win them back. Not to prove your worth. But because presence itself is defiance. If you were the one they erased, but you refuse to disappear anymore, write this in the comments. I was the forgotten child. I see myself now. They called you invisible to excuse their neglect, but you were never lost. You were erased. And now, the silence is over. Being seen on your terms was always the rebellion.